The call came while I was standing in the rain outside the VA hospital in Phoenix, still processing my latest appointment about my shoulder injury from my third deployment. 22 years of military service, and my body was finally catching up with all those missions in Afghanistan and Iraq. My phone buzzed against my tactical jacket, the same one I'd worn during countless operations overseas. The caller ID showed Mom, and for a split second, I almost let it go to voicemail. Something in my gut told me this wasn't going to be good news. "Sarah, honey, I hope you're sitting down." My mother's voice came through the speaker, artificially cheerful in that way that always preceded bad news. "Your father and I have some exciting news about the house." The house, my childhood home on Maple Street in small-town Colorado, the 2-story colonial where I'd grown up dreaming of serving my country, where I'd packed my bags at 18 to join the Army, where I'd returned on leave between deployments to find comfort in familiar walls and memories. The house I'd been paying the mortgage on for the past 8 years while my parents lived there rent-free. The house that was supposed to be my sanctuary when I finally retired from active duty. "We sold it, sweetheart," she continued, her tone light as if she were announcing what she'd made for dinner. "Got a fantastic offer, well above market value. The buyers were so eager they paid cash and everything. Closed yesterday." I felt the Arizona sun beating down on my face as the words registered, but somehow I suddenly felt cold. The rain had stopped, but I was still standing there, frozen, as civilians walked past me into the medical center. My left hand instinctively went to my right shoulder, where shrapnel from an IED had torn through muscle and bone during my final deployment 3 years ago. The pain was always worse when stress hit. "Mom, what do you mean you sold it?" My voice came out steady, controlled, the same tone I'd used when briefing generals on classified operations. "That's my house. I've been paying the mortgage for 8 years. "Oh, Sarah, don't be so dramatic," she laughed, that dismissive sound I'd heard my entire life whenever I challenged anything they did. "Technically, the deed is still in our names. You know we kept it that way for tax purposes when you started making those payments. Besides, your father's knee surgery was more expensive than we expected, and we needed the equity." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, counting to 10 the way my combat stress counselor had taught me. Through the phone, I could hear my father in the background, his voice gruff and impatient as always. "Tell her it's done, Linda. Business is business. Business is business." The same phrase he'd used when I was 16 and wanted to apply to West Point when he'd refused to co-sign my application because girls don't belong in combat zones. The same words he'd thrown at me when I'd come home on leave after my first deployment and found out they'd spent my signing bonus that I'd left them for emergencies on a new boat. The identical dismissal when I'd asked them to help with down payment on my own place after my second tour, only to be told that I should be grateful they were letting me keep contributing to their mortgage instead. Where exactly am I supposed to live when I finish my disability processing? I asked, watching a young soldier in ACUs walk past me toward the entrance. He couldn't have been more than 19, probably fresh out of basic training, heading to his own medical appointment. I remembered being that young, that hopeful, believing that serving my country meant something, that family meant something. "Well, you can always stay with Marcus and Jennifer," my mother replied. "They have that big house now with plenty of room. Or there's always the spare bedroom at Aunt Carol's place." Marcus, my younger brother who'd never served a day in uniform, who'd gotten his college paid for while I'd earned mine through the GI Bill after bleeding for it overseas. Marcus, who now ran a successful real estate development company, who'd married his college sweetheart and lived in a suburban mansion, who'd never missed a family dinner or disappointed our parents with inconvenient life choices like joining the military. "Mom, I've been deployed for most of the last 2 decades. I've served 3 combat tours. I've earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. That house was supposed to be my home base when I transitioned out of active duty." I kept my voice level, professional, even though inside I felt like that 18-year-old girl again, being told her dreams didn't matter. "Oh, Sarah, you're being so emotional," she sighed. "It's not like you were ever really there anyway. Always off gallivanting around the world with the army. Besides, the buyers seemed like such a nice family. They have children, you know. They'll actually use the house properly." Gallivanting around the world. As if my deployments to war zones had been some kind of extended vacation. As if the nights I'd spent in bunkers listening to incoming mortar fire, the months I'd gone without seeing sunlight except through armored vehicle windows, the times I'd held dying soldiers in my arms while waiting for medevac helicopters had been some kind of adventure tourism. "Who bought it?" I asked, more out of curiosity than any real hope that it mattered. "Some company called Fortress Investments," my mother replied. "They specialize in military housing or something like that. The realtor said they buy homes in areas with veteran populations. Isn't that nice? It's almost like fate." Fortress Investments. I knew that name, but I couldn't quite place it. Something tickled at the back of my mind, a memory from a briefing or a conversation, but the shock of losing my home was making it hard to think clearly. "I have to go," I said, ending the call before my mother could launch into more explanations about how this was actually good for me somehow. I stood there in the Phoenix heat, watching more veterans and active duty soldiers stream past me into the medical center, and felt more alone than I had during any of my overseas deployments. 22 years of service, 3 combat tours, multiple commendations for valor under fire. I'd led soldiers through some of the most dangerous territory on Earth, made life and death decisions that saved American lives, earned the respect of generals and enlisted personnel alike. But to my family, I was still just Sarah, the dramatic daughter who'd chosen a difficult path instead of staying home and playing it safe like Marcus. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Lieutenant Colonel Jessica Martinez had been my commanding officer during my second deployment and had become one of my closest friends in the service. She'd retired 2 years before me and now worked as a consultant for military contractors. If anyone could help me understand what was happening, it would be Jess. "Sarah Chen, how are you doing, warrior?" Jess's voice was warm and familiar, carrying that slight Texas accent that had gotten us both through some very dark nights in Kandahar. "Not." "Great, Jess. I need to ask you something. Have you ever heard of a company called Fortress Investments?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost hear Jess thinking, "Fortress Investments? Why do you ask?" "They just bought my family home. My parents sold it without telling me, and apparently this company specializes in military housing." "Sarah," Jess's voice had changed, become more serious. "Where are you right now?" "Phoenix. Outside the VA hospital." "Can you get somewhere private? Like, really private?" Something in her tone made my military instincts kick in. This wasn't just casual conversation anymore. "Yeah, give me 5 minutes." I walked to my truck, a beat-up Ford F-150 that had seen better days but had never let me down, much like myself. Once I was inside with the doors closed and the engine running for air conditioning, I called Jess back. "Okay, I'm secure." "Sarah, Fortress Investments isn't just some real estate company. They're a subsidiary of a much larger organization. Military contractors, private security, veteran services, big money, serious connections. The kind of outfit that has contracts with the Pentagon and probably knows more about current military operations than most people in uniform." My blood ran cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if they bought your family home specifically, it wasn't random. Companies like that don't just stumble onto properties. They research, they target, they have reasons." Jess paused. "Sarah, is there something you haven't told me about your discharge? Some kind of special assignment or classification I don't know about?" I thought about my final months in service, the debriefings, the medical evaluations, the paperwork that had seemed endless. Most of it had been routine, standard procedure for someone transitioning out after 2 decades of active duty. But there had been a few meetings, a few conversations with people who hadn't worn uniforms, who'd ask questions about my future plans and my family situation. "I don't think so," I said. But even as I spoke, I wasn't entirely sure. The military had a way of compartmentalizing information, of keeping soldiers in the dark about the bigger picture even when they were part of it. "Sarah, I want you to be very careful. If Fortress Investments has taken an interest in your family situation, there's more going on here than your parents needing money for medical bills. I'm going to make some calls, see what I can find out. In the meantime, don't do anything dramatic. Don't confront your family. Don't try to contact the company. Just sit tight and let me do some digging." After I hung up with Jess, I sat in my truck for a long time, air conditioning running, watching people come and go from the VA hospital. Some were young, like that soldier I'd seen earlier. Others were older, gray-haired veterans of Vietnam, or Gulf War conflicts, walking with canes or using wheelchairs, bearing the visible and invisible wounds of their service. All of us had given something to our country, had sacrificed family time and personal comfort, and sometimes our physical and mental health for the idea that we were protecting something larger than ourselves. And now, apparently, my family had sold the one place that represented stability and home to some mysterious military contractor that my former commanding officer was warning me to be careful around. The house where I'd planned to recover from my injuries, where I'd hoped to finally put down roots after 2 decades of temporary assignments and deployment cycles, was gone. Sold to strangers who somehow knew enough about my military background to specifically target that property. I started the truck and pulled out of the VA hospital parking lot, not sure where I was going, but knowing I couldn't just sit there anymore. As I drove through Phoenix traffic, past strip malls and housing developments that all looked the same, I tried to make sense of what had happened. My parents had always been practical to the point of coldness, but selling my house without even consulting me seemed extreme even for them. And this Fortress Investments company, whatever Jess suspected about them, had apparently made an offer too good to refuse for a modest 2-story house in small-town Colorado. None of it made sense, but then again, very little about my relationship with my family had ever made sense. They'd never understood why I'd chosen military service over college and a traditional career path. They'd never quite forgiven me for missing family gatherings due to deployment schedules, for putting duty before family dinners and holiday celebrations. To them, I'd always been the difficult daughter who'd chosen a hard path instead of an easy one, who'd prioritized strangers in uniform over blood relatives at home. But I'd thought, after all these years, after proving myself in combat zones, and earning recognition from my peers and superiors, that they'd finally understand that my service had meaning, that the house I'd been paying for, the home I'd been maintaining for them while I was overseas, represented some kind of acknowledgement that I belonged somewhere, that I had earned a place in their lives and their respect. Apparently, I'd been wrong about that too. The next morning, I drove the 6 hours from Phoenix to Colorado Springs, my shoulder aching with every mile as I gripped the steering wheel of my old Ford. The familiar landscape of desert giving way to mountains should have felt like coming home, but instead it felt like approaching a crime scene. I'd barely slept in the cheap motel outside Flagstaff, my mind racing with questions about Fortress Investments and what Jess had implied about my situation being more complicated than a simple real estate transaction. I pulled into the parking lot of Mountain View Coffee, the same place where I'd met with my transition counselor 6 months ago when I'd first started planning my post-military life. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was back in the same booth, but instead of planning my future, I was trying to piece together how my past had just been sold out from under me. My phone buzzed with a text from Jess. "Call me when you're alone. Found some interesting information." I ordered a black coffee, extra strong, and settled into the corner booth with the best view of the parking lot. Old habits from 22 years of military service die hard. You always want to see who's coming and going. The waitress, A middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a name tag reading Betty refilled my cup without being asked. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders, honey," she said softly. "Anything I can do to help?" "Just one of those days," I replied, managing a weak smile. Betty reminded me of the civilian contractors who'd worked in our dining facilities overseas, the ones who'd always had a kind word and extra portions for soldiers having rough days. "Actually, you wouldn't happen to know anything about a company called Fortress Investments, would you? They apparently bought some property around here recently." Betty's expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Fortress? Yeah, they've been buying up quite a bit of real estate in the area lately. Military housing, they say? Lots of. Folks around here have military backgrounds, what with the Air Force Academy and all the bases nearby." She paused, studying my face. "You military?" 22 years Army. Just transitioned out. I didn't mention the disability processing or the fact that my own family had just sold my house to this mysterious company. "What kind of reputation do they have locally?" "Well, they pay cash, close fast, never lowball anyone. But there's something." Betty looked around the mostly empty coffee shop and lowered her voice. "My nephew works construction, and he's done some projects for them. Says their job sites are different. More security than you'd expect for regular residential work. Background checks for all the workers, NDAs, the whole 9 yards." She shrugged. "Could be nothing, but it strikes folks as odd for a housing company." After Betty moved on to other customers, I called Jess back, keeping my voice low despite being relatively alone in the coffee shop. "Sarah, where are you?" Jess's voice was tense. "Colorado Springs. I drove up from Phoenix this morning." "Good. Don't go to your family's house yet. I've been making calls all night, and what I found out is complicated." I heard papers rustling in the background. "Fortress Investments is a front company, Sarah. They're owned by Blackstone Security Solutions, which is one of the largest military contractors in the world. They handle everything from overseas security operations to domestic veteran transition services." "Veteran transition services?" My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. "What does that mean?" "It means they're in the business of tracking and managing former military personnel, especially those with specific skill sets or security clearances." "Sarah, I pulled your service record through some contacts I still have at the Pentagon. Your file has been flagged for something called the Strategic Asset Monitoring Program." I felt the blood drain from my face. I've never heard of that program. Most people haven't. It's designed to keep tabs on former military personnel who might be valuable for future private sector operations or who might pose security risks if they fall through the cracks. Based on your background in military intelligence and your combat experience, especially your time with Joint Special Operations Command, you'd be exactly the kind of person they'd want to monitor. Military intelligence. JSOC. Classifications that I wasn't supposed to discuss with anyone, even close friends like Jess. But she was right. My final years of service hadn't been typical infantry work. I'd been part of specialized units that operated in the gray areas between conventional military operations and intelligence gathering. The kind of work that left you with knowledge that certain people might want to keep track of long after you'd turned in your uniform. "So you're telling me that my parents didn't just randomly get a great offer on the house? This company specifically targeted my family property as part of some kind of surveillance program?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you. And Sarah, there's more." Blackstone Security Solutions has been awarded several major contracts in the past 2 years for what they call veteran reintegration support. Officially, they're supposed to help former military personnel transition to civilian life. Unofficially, they're building a database of former service members with valuable skills and keeping track of where they are and what they're doing. I thought about all the paperwork I'd filled out during my discharge process, all the questions about my post-military plans, my family situation, my financial circumstances. At the time, it had seemed like standard bureaucracy, The military's way of making sure veterans didn't slip through the cracks and end up homeless or worse. Now I wondered if that information had been passed along to private contractors who had their own reasons for wanting to know where I'd be living. Jess, they bought my house. My family sold it to them. That means they know exactly where I was planning to live, and now they control that property. Which gives them leverage over you, Jess confirmed. Think about it, Sarah. You're processing a disability claim through the VA, which means you're dealing with financial uncertainty. You were counting on having a place to live while you figured out your next steps. Now that's been taken away, and coincidentally, there's a company that specializes in helping veterans with exactly those kinds of problems. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about my parents' financial problems or their lack of consideration for my plans. This was about a private military contractor that had identified me as someone worth tracking and had manipulated my family situation to put me in a vulnerable position where I might need their help. What kind of work does Blackstone actually do? I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. Overseas security, operations, intelligence gathering, domestic surveillance contracts with various government agencies. They recruit heavily from former military personnel, especially those with combat experience and security clearances. The kind of work that pays very well but requires absolute loyalty and discretion. I finished my coffee and stared out the window, at the Colorado mountains, thinking about all the former military contractors I'd encountered during my deployments. Some had been good people doing necessary work in difficult circumstances. Others had been mercenaries with flexible ethics and unlimited expense accounts, the kind of operators who made fortunes in war zones while active duty personnel earned military pay and followed rules of engagement. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. During your final months of service, did anyone approach you about private sector opportunities? Any casual conversations about your post-military plans that seemed a little too interested in your specific background? I thought back to those last few months at Fort Carson, the debriefings and medical evaluations and transition counseling sessions. There had been a few meetings that hadn't quite fit the normal pattern. Conversations with civilian personnel who'd asked detailed questions about my family situation and my financial plans. At the time, I'd assumed they were part of the standard discharge process, making sure I had adequate support systems and wouldn't become a veteran suicide statistic. There were a few meetings with people I didn't recognize, I admitted. Civilians who said they were from veteran services organizations, asking about my transition plans and my family support network. They seemed particularly interested in whether I had stable housing arrangements and whether I was considering any kind of private sector work that might utilize my military background. And you told them about the house your parents were living in, the one you'd been paying for? I told them I had stable housing arranged and a strong family support system. The words tasted like ash in my mouth now. They asked specific questions about my financial obligations and whether I had any concerns about my post-military living situation. Jesus, Sarah, they were gathering intelligence on you from day one of your discharge process. They knew exactly how to pressure your family situation to put you in a position where you'd need their help. I stood up from the booth and walked outside, needing fresh air and space to think. The Colorado mountains stretched out in front of me, the same view I'd grown up with, the landscape that had shaped my understanding of home and belonging. Somewhere in those mountains was the house I'd grown up in, the place I'd thought would be my sanctuary during this difficult transition period. Instead, it was now owned by a private military contractor that had apparently been tracking me since before I'd even left active duty. Jess, what would you do if you were in my position? I'd be very, very careful. Companies like Blackstone don't invest this kind of time and resources in someone unless they want something specific. They've created a situation where you're financially vulnerable and housing insecure, which makes you a prime candidate for their recruitment efforts. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I thought about my options. I could confront my parents, but what would that accomplish besides confirming to Blackstone that I'd figured out their game? I could try to contact Fortress Investments directly, but that would also tip my hand. I could simply disappear, use my military training to go off-grid and start over somewhere else, but that would mean abandoning any chance of getting my house back and letting them win. Or I could play their game, but play it better than they expected. Jess, you said Blackstone has been awarded contracts for veteran reintegration support. What exactly does that involve? Housing assistance, job placement services, financial counseling, mental health support. They're supposed to be helping veterans transition successfully to civilian life, preventing homelessness and unemployment and all the problems that can lead to veteran suicides. And they get paid by the government for these services? Handsomely. It's a multi-million-dollar contract. I thought about all the veterans I'd seen at the VA hospital yesterday, the young soldiers and the older ones, all of us dealing with the challenges of transitioning from military service to civilian life. If Blackstone was being paid to help veterans like us, but was actually manipulating our situations to recruit us for private military work, then they were committing fraud on a massive scale. Jess, I need you to help me with something. I want to find out exactly how many other veterans have had similar experiences with Fortress Investments. If they're using this strategy systematically, there should be a pattern. Sarah, that's dangerous territory. If you start investigating a major defense contractor, you're going to attract attention you might not want. I'm already attracting their attention, I pointed out. They bought my house, remember? The question is whether I'm going to let them dictate the terms of this engagement, or whether I'm going to take some initiative. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, Jess sighed. You know what? You're right. These bastards have been playing games with veterans' lives, and somebody needs to call them on it. What do you need from me? Everything. You can find about Blackstone's veteran services contracts, any complaints or investigations, and a list of properties that Fortress Investments has purchased in the past 2 years. If we're going to take these people on, we need to understand exactly how they operate. After I hung up with Jess, I sat in my truck for a while, watching people come and go from the coffee shop, thinking about the path that had led me to this moment. 22 years ago, I'd joined the Army because I believed in serving something larger than myself, in protecting my country and the people I cared about. I'd never imagined that my service would make me a target for private contractors, who saw veterans as commodities to be tracked and manipulated. But if Blackstone Security Solutions thought they could use my family against me, if they believed they could manipulate my housing situation to force me into their employment, they had seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. I hadn't survived 3 combat deployments and earned recognition for valor under fire by backing down from fights with better-funded opponents. It was time to show them what a career military intelligence specialist could do when she was properly motivated. The drive to my parents' house took me through the familiar streets of Millbrook, Colorado, population 8,400, where everyone knew everyone else's business and military families were as common as pickup trucks. I passed the elementary school where I'd first learned about Veterans Day, the high school where my guidance counselor had tried to talk me out of enlisting, and the small downtown where yellow ribbon magnets on car bumpers had been the extent of most people's support for the troops overseas. Nothing had changed much in the 2 decades since I'd left for basic training. The same chain restaurants lined the main highway. The same local businesses struggled to compete with big box stores 40 minutes away in Colorado Springs, and the same mixture of pride and resentment toward military families persisted in a town that benefited economically from nearby bases while sometimes treating service members like unwelcome outsiders. I pulled into the driveway of 1247 Maple Street and sat there for a moment, looking at the house I'd grown up in. The blue shutters needed painting, the front porch sagged slightly on the left side, and the small garden my mother had always been proud of looked neglected. But it was still home, or at least it had been until yesterday when my parents had sold it to a private military contractor without bothering to consult the daughter who'd been paying the mortgage. Before I could change my mind, I walked up the front steps and knocked on the door. My mother answered, looking flustered and avoiding eye contact. "Sarah, honey, I wasn't expecting you," she said, not inviting me inside. "I thought you were still in Phoenix dealing with your medical appointments." "I drove up this morning. We need to talk about the house, Mom." "Oh, sweetheart, there's nothing to discuss. It's already sold, signed, and sealed. The new owners take possession next week." She finally stepped aside to let me in, but her body language remained tense and defensive. The living room looked exactly the same as it had during my last visit 6 months ago, except for the cardboard boxes stacked against one wall. My father sat in his recliner, the same spot where he'd delivered lectures about my poor life choices throughout my teenage years. He looked up from his newspaper with the expression of someone who'd been expecting an unpleasant conversation. "Sarah, your mother said you were upset about the house situation." "Upset doesn't begin to cover it, Dad. I've been paying the mortgage on this place for 8 years. You sold my house without even telling me you were considering it." "Your house?" My father folded his newspaper with deliberate precision. "The deed is in our names, Sarah. We've been living here for 30 years. You've been gallivanting around the world playing soldier, sending us money when it was convenient for you." Playing soldier. The same dismissive phrase he'd used when I'd called home from Afghanistan to tell them about my first Bronze Star, when I'd tried to explain why I couldn't come home for Christmas because my unit was deployed to Iraq, when I'd attempted to share any aspect of my military experience that didn't fit his narrow understanding of what my service meant. I wasn't playing soldier, Dad. I was serving my country, and I wasn't sending you money when it was convenient. I was paying your mortgage every month for 8 years, even when I was deployed in combat zones, even when I was recovering from injuries, even when it meant I couldn't afford my own place. My mother intervened with the same tone she'd used to settle arguments between Marcus and me when we were children. "Let's not get dramatic, Sarah. Your father's knee surgery was more expensive than we anticipated, and we needed the equity from the house." The buyers offered significantly more than the current market value. "How much more?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "60,000 over asking price," my father said. "Cash offer, no inspection, closed in 2 weeks. It was too good to pass up." 60,000 over market value for a modest house in a small Colorado town. Exactly the kind of offer that would be impossible to refuse, especially for parents who'd never understood the concept of consulting their daughter before making decisions that affected her life. Blackstone had done their research well, knowing exactly how much money it would take to overcome any family loyalty or consideration for my situation. Did you ask yourselves why someone would pay so much over market value for this house? I kept my voice level, professional. The same tone I'd use during intelligence briefings when I needed to present facts without revealing how much I knew. "We assumed they really wanted the property," my mother replied. "The realtor said the company specializes in military housing, and this area has a lot of veterans. Maybe they're planning to renovate and resell. Or maybe they had other reasons for wanting this specific house." I looked around the living room, at the family photos on the mantle that documented Marcus's achievements while barely acknowledging my military service. Did the realtor mention that Fortress Investments is owned by a private military contractor called Blackstone Security Solutions? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. My parents exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that happens between people who've been married for decades and are trying to decide how much to admit. "The realtor may have mentioned something about the company's military connections," my father said finally. "We thought that was a good thing, considering your background." "My background? You mean the fact that I spent 22 years in the, Army, including 3 combat deployments and specialized intelligence work that I'm not allowed to discuss even with my own family? Sarah, we know you're proud of your military service," my mother said, "but we don't understand why that matters for a simple real estate transaction." I realized then that they genuinely didn't comprehend what they'd done. To them, I was still the rebellious 18-year-old who'd chosen the Army over college, The daughter who'd disappointed them by picking a difficult path instead of following Marcus's example of staying home and building a conventional life. They'd never understood that my military service involved anything more complex than following orders and collecting a paycheck. It matters because companies like Blackstone don't randomly buy houses for $60,000 over market value. They had a specific reason for wanting this property, and that reason has to do with me and my military background. That's ridiculous, my father said. You're being paranoid. It was just good business for them and good luck for us. Dad, I spent the last decade of my military career in intelligence work. I know how to recognize when I'm being targeted by people who want something from me. This wasn't luck. It was a calculated move designed to put me in a financially vulnerable position. Financially vulnerable? My mother's voice rose. Sarah, you have disability benefits from the Army. You have savings. You're not some helpless victim. I have disability benefits that haven't been processed yet, which means I'm currently living on savings while I wait for the VA to determine how much monthly compensation I'll receive. And I had a place to live while I figured out my next steps, until you sold it without consulting me. The conversation was going in circles, the same pattern of misunderstanding and dismissal that had characterized my relationship with my parents throughout my adult life. They'd never grasped the significance of my military service, had never understood that my absence from family gatherings wasn't a choice, but a consequence of deployment schedules and duty requirements. Where's Marcus? I asked, changing the subject. I assume he knows about the house being sold. He's at the office, my father replied. He's been helping us with the legal paperwork and the financial arrangements. Of course he had. Marcus, who'd never left Colorado, who'd built his real estate development company with loans co-signed by our parents, who'd always been available for family emergencies because he'd never deployed to combat zones or spent months at a time in countries where phone calls home were impossible. Did Marcus know about the offer from Fortress Investments before you accepted it? He helped us evaluate it, my mother admitted. He said it was an excellent opportunity, financially speaking. I thought about Marcus's real estate company, his connections in the local business community, his reputation for being able to broker deals that other people couldn't make happen. Had he known about Blackstone's interest in our family property? Had he helped facilitate the sale, either knowingly or unknowingly? I need to talk to Marcus, I said, standing up from the couch. Where's his office? Sarah, don't go over there and cause a scene, my mother pleaded. Marcus was just trying to help us make a good financial decision. I'm not going to cause a scene, Mom. I'm going to have a conversation with my brother about who he's been doing business with and whether he understands the implications of what just happened. As I walked toward the door, my father's voice stopped me. Sarah, I know you're upset about the house, but we had to think about our own financial security. Your mother and I aren't getting any younger, and we needed the equity to cover medical expenses and prepare for retirement. I turned back to face him, seeing for the first time how much he'd aged in the past few years. His hair was completely gray now, his face lined with worry and fatigue. For a moment, I felt a flash of sympathy for the position he and my mother were in, caught between their own financial needs and their daughter's housing situation. Dad, I understand that you needed the money. What I don't understand is why you didn't talk to me about it first. We could have worked something out. I could have helped you restructure the mortgage or found other ways to address your financial needs that didn't involve selling the house to a private military contractor. We didn't want to burden you with our problems, my mother said quietly. You've already done so much for us, and we knew you were dealing with your own transition issues. Burden me? I've been paying your mortgage for 8 years. I've been financially supporting this family since I was 25 years old. How exactly would discussing a major financial decision with me have been a burden? The question hung in the air between us, highlighting the fundamental disconnect that had always existed in our family dynamics. My parents had been happy to accept my financial support, but they'd never considered me an equal partner in decisions that affected all of us. To them, I was still the daughter who'd chosen an unconventional path, whose opinions and needs were secondary to the more traditional family structure that Marcus represented. "I'm going to talk to Marcus," I said again, "and then I'm going to find out exactly what Fortress Investments is planning to do with this house and whether there are any legal options for reversing this sale." "Sarah, it's done," my father said. "The contracts are signed, the money has been transferred, there's no going back now. We'll see about that." I left my parents' house with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer understanding of how Blackstone had manipulated the situation. They'd done their research thoroughly, understanding not just my financial circumstances, but also my family dynamics. They'd known that my parents would be tempted by a generous cash offer, especially one that came with a tight timeline that didn't allow for extended family discussions. What they probably hadn't anticipated was that I would figure out what they were doing and start investigating their operations. Private military contractors were used to dealing with desperate veterans who needed jobs and housing assistance, not with former intelligence specialists who understood how to gather information and build cases against targets. As I drove toward Marcus's office, I thought about the skills I'd developed during my military career. 22 years of service had taught me how to analyze complex situations, identify threats and opportunities, and develop strategic responses to challenges. I'd operated in environments where the stakes were life and death, where making the wrong decision could cost American lives. Compared to combat operations in Afghanistan and Iraq, dealing with a private military contractor that thought they could manipulate my family situation seemed almost manageable. The difference was that, in combat zones, I'd had the full resources of the United States military behind me. Now I was operating alone, with limited resources and no official support structure. But I also had something that Blackstone might not have anticipated: a deep understanding of how military contractors operated, gained through years of working alongside them in overseas operations. I knew their tactics, their priorities, and their weaknesses. More importantly, I knew that companies like Blackstone depended on veterans being isolated and desperate, willing to accept whatever terms were offered without asking too many questions. They'd made a mistake when they'd chosen to target me. Instead of creating a desperate veteran who would gratefully accept their assistance, they'd created an adversary who understood their methods and had the skills to fight back. The question now was whether I could gather enough evidence to expose their operations before they realized what I was doing and took steps to neutralize the threat I represented. Marcus's office sat in a gleaming glass building on the outskirts of Millbrook, part of a small business complex that had sprung up in the last decade as the town tried to diversify its economy beyond agriculture and military dependence. Chen Development Group occupied the entire second floor, a testament to how successful my younger brother had become while I was overseas serving my country. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile, looked up as I entered. "Good morning. I'm here to see Marcus Chen," I said, keeping my tone professional but firm. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, already reaching for her appointment book. "I'm his sister. Tell him Sarah needs to speak with him about the family real estate transaction." Her expression shifted slightly, recognition flickering across her face. "Oh, you're Sarah. Marcus has mentioned you. Let me check if he's available." She picked up her phone and spoke quietly for a moment before hanging up. "He'll see you now. Conference room B, down the hall on your right." I walked down the hallway, noting the expensive artwork on the walls and the thick carpeting under my feet. Marcus had done well for himself, building a successful business that clearly generated significant revenue. The contrast with my own financial situation, living on savings while waiting for disability benefits to be processed, wasn't lost on me. Marcus was waiting in the conference room, standing by a wall of windows that overlooked the Colorado mountains. He'd always been the handsome one in the family, with our father's strong jaw and our mother's dark eyes. At 32, He looked every inch the successful businessman in his tailored suit and expensive watch. "Sarah," he said, turning to face me with what I recognized as his practiced business smile. "Mom called and said you were upset about the house situation. I was hoping we could talk about this like adults." "That's exactly what I'm here to do. Marcus, I want to understand your role in facilitating the sale of my house to Fortress Investments." "Your house?" His eyebrows rose in a gesture that reminded me of our father. "Sarah, the deed was in Mom and Dad's names. You know that, and they needed the equity to cover Dad's medical expenses and prepare for retirement. I've been paying the mortgage for 8 years, Marcus. Every month without fail, even when I was deployed in combat zones. That makes it my house in every way that matters." Marcus moved to the conference table and gestured for me to sit down. "Look, I understand you're frustrated about not being consulted, but this was a business decision that needed to be made quickly. The offer from Fortress Investments was significantly above market value, and they wanted a fast closing. If we'd waited to have extended family discussions, we might have lost the opportunity." "Tell me about Fortress Investments. What do you know about them beyond the fact that they made a generous offer?" "They're a legitimate real estate investment company that specializes in military housing. They have projects throughout Colorado and several other states. Their references checked out, their financing was solid, and they were willing to pay cash with no contingencies." I studied my brother's face, looking for signs of deception or discomfort. Marcus had always been good at maintaining a poker face during family arguments, but I'd spent years learning to read people during intelligence briefings and interrogations. Something in his body language suggested he wasn't telling me everything. He knew. "Did you research the company beyond their real estate activities?" "I did standard due diligence," he replied, but his eyes didn't quite meet mine. "Financial stability, business registration, references from other transactions, everything. Checked out." "Marcus, Fortress Investments is owned by Blackstone Security Solutions, which is a private military contractor. Did your due diligence reveal that connection?" The silence that followed was telling. Marcus looked out the window, then back at me, his expression carefully neutral. "I may have come across some information about their parent company, but that didn't seem relevant to the real estate transaction." "It didn't seem relevant that a private military contractor was paying $60,000 over market value for the house where a former Army intelligence specialist was planning to live." "Sarah, you're being paranoid. Not everything is a conspiracy. Sometimes a good business deal is just a good business deal." I leaned forward, using the same intensity I'd employed during military briefings when I needed to get through to someone who wasn't grasping the significance of intelligence reports. "Marcus, I spent the last decade of my military career in specialized intelligence work. I know how to recognize when someone is targeting me for recruitment or surveillance. This wasn't a random real estate transaction." "Even if that's true, what difference does it make now? The sale is complete, the money has been transferred, and Mom and Dad have already started making plans for their retirement. The difference is that you helped facilitate a transaction that was designed to manipulate my living situation and make me vulnerable to recruitment by a private military contractor. Whether you knew it or not, you participated in an operation that was targeting your own sister." Marcus stood up and walked back to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Sarah, you've been away from home for most of the last 20 years. You don't understand how difficult things have been for Mom and Dad financially. Dad's knee surgery cost more than their insurance covered, and they're getting older. They needed the security that this sale provided. I understand their financial pressures, Marcus. What I don't understand is why you didn't call me before facilitating the sale. I could have helped them find other solutions that didn't involve selling the house to a company that specializes in manipulating veterans." "Because you're never here," he said, turning to face me. "You're always somewhere else, dealing with your military obligations or your medical appointments or your transition issues. Mom and Dad needed help immediately, and I was the one who was available to provide it." The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to be painful. I had been absent from many family situations over the years, not by choice, but because of deployment schedules and military commitments that couldn't be rescheduled for family convenience. But that absence had been in service to my country. Not because I'd chosen to prioritize my career over family obligations. I was absent because I was serving my country, Marcus. Every deployment, every training exercise, every assignment that took me away from home was in service to something larger than myself. And even while I was gone, I was still supporting this family financially. I know that, and I respect your service. But respect doesn't pay medical bills or cover mortgage payments when Dad couldn't work after his surgery. I was paying the mortgage payments, I reminded him, every month for 8 years. And if you'd called me about Dad's medical expenses, I could have helped with those too. Marcus returned to his seat at the conference table, his expression softening slightly. Sarah, I know you've made sacrifices for your military career, and I know you've been generous with financial support. But you have to understand that Mom and Dad see me as the one who's been consistently present in their lives. When they needed help with a major financial decision, they turned to me because I'm the one who's been here. And now that decision has put me in a position where I'm financially vulnerable and housing insecure, which makes me a perfect target for recruitment by the same company that bought my house. Do you see how that might be a problem? If this company is really interested in recruiting you, isn't that potentially a good thing? Private military contractors pay well, and you have skills that are valuable in the civilian market. I stared at my brother, trying to determine whether he was genuinely naive about the implications of what had happened or whether he was deliberately avoiding the ethical issues involved. Marcus, companies like Blackstone don't recruit people through legitimate channels. They manipulate circumstances to create vulnerability and desperation. They've taken away my housing security and put me in a position where I might be tempted to accept employment that I wouldn't otherwise consider. Sarah, you're an intelligent, capable woman with 22 years of military experience. No one can force you to take a job you don't want. But they can create circumstances that make it difficult to refuse. And that's exactly what they've done by manipulating my family situation. Marcus looked down at his hands, and for the first time since I'd arrived, his confident businessman facade cracked slightly. Sarah, I need to tell you something. About 6 months ago, I was approached by a representative from Blackstone Security Solutions. They said they were interested in partnering with local real estate developers on military housing projects. My blood ran cold. What kind of partnership? They wanted to identify properties in areas with high veteran populations, particularly homes owned by military families who might be facing financial difficulties. They offered to pay finder's fees for properties that met their criteria. And you didn't think to mention this when our parents were considering selling the house? I didn't make the connection at the time. The representative I met with was from their real estate division, not their security operations. They presented it as a legitimate business opportunity to help veterans with housing needs. Marcus, did you receive a finder's fee for facilitating the sale of our parents' house? The silence stretched between us, and I could see the answer in his expression before he spoke. Yes, but I didn't solicit the transaction. When Mom and Dad told me they needed to sell the house, I mentioned it to my contact at Blackstone because I thought they might be interested in the property. How much? $15,000. I felt a surge of anger that I struggled to control. My brother had profited from the sale of my house to a company that was targeting me for recruitment. Whether he'd understood the full implications of what he was doing or not, he'd participated in an operation that had put me in a vulnerable position. Marcus, you took money from a private military contractor for helping them acquire the house I'd been paying for. Do you understand how that looks? It looks like I helped my parents solve a financial problem while also earning a legitimate business commission. Sarah, I didn't know about the connection to your military background. I thought it was just a real estate transaction. But now you do know. And now you understand that you've been used as a tool to manipulate your own sister's living situation. Marcus stood up and walked to the window again, his shoulders tense. What do you want me to do about it? The sale is complete, the money has been transferred, and everyone has moved on with their lives. I want you to help me understand exactly what Blackstone is planning. I want to know about their other real estate acquisitions in this area, their business relationships with local developers, and any other information you have about their operations. Sarah, I can't share confidential business information about my clients. Your clients? Marcus, these people manipulated our family situation to target me for recruitment. They're not your clients, they're your handlers. And if you don't start treating this situation with the seriousness it deserves, you're going to find yourself in more trouble than you can handle. I pulled out my phone and showed him the notes I'd taken during my conversation with Jess. I've been researching Blackstone Security Solutions, and what I've found suggests they're operating a systematic program to identify and recruit former military personnel through manipulation of their housing and financial situations. If that's true, then your real estate partnership with them makes you an accessory to fraud. Marcus read through my notes, his expression growing more concerned with each line. Sarah, I had no idea about any of this. They presented everything as legitimate business opportunities. That's how sophisticated operations work, Marcus. They compartmentalize information so that people like you can participate without understanding the full scope of what's happening. But now you do understand, and you have a choice to make. What kind of choice? You can help me gather evidence about their operations and potentially expose what they're doing to other veterans, or you can continue to pretend that you're just an innocent businessman who happened to profit from your sister's misfortune. Marcus returned to his seat at the conference table, his expression serious for the first time since I'd arrived. If what you're saying is true, then I've been manipulated just as much as you have. They used my real estate business to help them target you, and they paid me just enough to make sure I wouldn't ask too many questions about their motives. Now you're starting to understand how they operate. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Marcus leaned back in his conference room chair, running his hands through his hair as the full implications of what I'd told him began to sink in. Sarah, if you're right about this, then I've been played by professionals. They approached me 6 months ago with what seemed like a legitimate business opportunity, and I walked right into it. Tell me everything about that initial contact, I said, pulling out my phone to record our conversation. Every detail you can remember. It was a woman named Patricia Hendricks. She said she represented Blackstone's real estate acquisition division, and that they were looking to partner with local developers in areas with high veteran populations. She was professional, well-dressed, knew the local market better than most outsiders would. She took me to lunch at the Broadmoor in Colorado Springs, talked about multi-million-dollar development projects, made it sound like the opportunity of a lifetime. Did she ask specific questions about military families in the area? Now that I think about it, yes. She was particularly interested in families who might be facing financial difficulties, recent retirees dealing with disability claims, anyone who might need to sell quickly for cash. At the time, I thought she was just doing market research. I thought about Patricia Hendricks, probably not her real name, trained in psychological manipulation and intelligence gathering. The kind of operative that companies like Blackstone used to identify and recruit assets without the targets understanding what was happening to them. She'd played Marcus perfectly, appealing to his business ambitions while gathering intelligence about vulnerable military families in the area. Marcus, I need you to contact Patricia Hendricks and tell her you have another property that might interest Blackstone. Don't mention our conversation, don't act suspicious. Just see if you can arrange another meeting. Sarah, I don't want to get in any deeper with these people. You're already in deep, Marcus. The question is whether you're going to help me expose what they're doing or continue to be their unwitting accomplice. He stared out the window at the Colorado mountains for a long moment before nodding. Okay, I'll contact her. But, Sarah, if This goes wrong. If they figure out what we're doing, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But right now, you're the only connection I have to their operations, and I need that access to gather evidence. While Marcus made the call to Patricia Hendricks, I stepped out of the conference room and called Jess back. She answered on the first ring, her voice tense with concern. "Sarah, where are you? I've been trying to reach you for hours." "I'm at my brother's office in Millbrook." "Jess, it's worse than we thought. Marcus has been working with Blackstone for months, helping them identify vulnerable military families. He didn't know what he was doing, but he's been feeding them intelligence about potential targets." Jesus Christ. Sarah, you need to be careful. If they've been monitoring your family for months, they probably know you're back in town asking questions. Let them know. I'm tired of being reactive. It's time to take the initiative. What are you planning? I'm going to meet with their local representative, see what kind of offer they make me, and gather evidence of their recruitment tactics. If I can document their methods, we might be able to expose their entire operation. Sarah, that's incredibly dangerous. These aren't amateur scam artists. They're professional intelligence operatives with unlimited resources and no oversight. And I'm a career military intelligence specialist with combat experience and nothing left to lose. They made a mistake when they targeted me, Jess. Instead of creating a desperate recruit, they've created an enemy who understands their methods. After I hung up with Jess, Marcus emerged from the conference room with a grim expression. Patricia Hendricks wants to meet tomorrow morning. She seemed very interested when I mentioned having a property owner who might be interested in their veteran services program. Perfect. Set up the meeting, but don't mention my name specifically. Just tell her you have a client who's a recently retired military intelligence specialist dealing with disability processing and housing issues. Sarah, are you sure about this? These people have been planning this operation for months. They're going to be prepared for anything you might try. Marcus, I've spent 22 years preparing for situations exactly like this. The only difference is that instead of fighting foreign enemies, I'm fighting domestic ones who are exploiting American veterans for profit. The next morning, I dressed carefully for my meeting with Patricia Hendricks. Professional but not too polished, someone who looked like she might be struggling with the transition from military to civilian life. I chose clothing that subtly displayed my military background without being obvious about it. A watch that former service members would recognize, a small pin that indicated my combat deployments, details that would confirm my credentials, without seeming like I was trying too hard. Marcus had arranged to meet Patricia at a coffee shop in Colorado Springs, neutral territory where we could have a private conversation without seeming suspicious. I arrived early and chose a table with good sightlines and multiple exit routes, old habits from intelligence work that had become second nature. Patricia Hendricks looked exactly like what I'd expected, mid-40s, expensively dressed, but not flashy, the kind of woman who could blend into any business environment while gathering intelligence on her targets. She had the confident bearing of someone who was used to manipulating conversations and controlling outcomes. "Ms. Chen," she said, extending her hand as Marcus introduced us. "Your brother tells me you might be interested in some of the services we provide to military veterans." "I'm not sure what I'm interested in," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Marcus said you work with veterans who are dealing with housing and employment transitions." "That's part of what we do," Patricia confirmed, settling into her chair with practiced ease. Blackstone Security Solutions has several divisions that work with former military personnel. We help with housing assistance, job placement, financial counseling, and career transition services. And what does that help typically involve? It depends on the individual's needs and background. For someone with your experience in military intelligence, we might be able to offer consulting opportunities that utilize your specialized skills while providing excellent compensation and benefits. I let a hint of interest show in my expression. What kind of consulting opportunities? Risk assessment, security analysis, intelligence gathering for corporate clients. the kind of work that pays significantly better than most civilian careers available to former military personnel. And the housing assistance? We maintain properties throughout the region that we make available to qualified veterans at below-market rates. In some cases, for veterans who work with us on a contract basis, we provide housing as part of their compensation package. I thought about my childhood home, now owned by Fortress Investments, and wondered how many other veterans had been manipulated into similar situations. That sounds almost too good to be true. We believe in taking care of the men and women who have served our country, Patricia said smoothly. Military veterans have skills and experience that are valuable in the private sector, but the transition to civilian employment can be challenging. We try to make that transition as smooth as possible. What would the next steps be if I were interested in learning more? We'd start with a comprehensive evaluation of your background, skills, and career goals. Then we'd match you with opportunities that fit your profile and compensation requirements. The process is completely confidential, and there's no obligation until you decide to move forward with a specific opportunity. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering her offer seriously. I have to admit, the timing is interesting. My family just sold the house I'd been living in, so I'm dealing with housing uncertainty at the same time I'm trying to figure out my career direction. That's exactly the kind of transition challenge we specialize in helping veterans navigate, Patricia replied, and I caught a brief flash of satisfaction in her eyes. We could potentially address both your housing and employment needs simultaneously. I'd like to know more about the evaluation process. Patricia reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder containing several documents. These are some preliminary forms that would give us a better understanding of your background and interests. If you decide to move forward, we'd schedule a more comprehensive interview and assessment. I accepted the folder and glanced through the documents, noting the detailed questions about my military service, security clearances, family situation, and financial circumstances. The forms were designed to gather exactly the kind of intelligence that would help them determine how much leverage they had over potential recruits. This looks fairly comprehensive, I observed. We found that the more we know about a veteran's background and circumstances, the better we can match them with appropriate opportunities. After Patricia left, Marcus and I sat in the coffee shop reviewing the documents she'd provided. The forms contained questions that went far beyond what any legitimate employment agency would need to know, including detailed inquiries about family, relationships, financial obligations, and personal vulnerabilities. Sarah, these questions are incredibly invasive, Marcus said, reading over my shoulder. They want to know everything about your personal life, your family dynamics, your financial situation. That's because they're not just evaluating me for employment opportunities. They're assessing how much control they can exert over my life circumstances. I pulled out my phone and took photos of each document. This is evidence of their recruitment methods, Marcus. No legitimate company would need this level of personal information for a consulting position. What are you going to do with this? I'm going to fill out the forms with carefully crafted responses that will give them enough real information to maintain their interest while protecting my actual vulnerabilities. Then I'm going to go through their evaluation process and document their recruitment tactics. Sarah, that's incredibly risky. If they figure out what you're doing, then I'll deal with that situation when it arises. But right now, this is the best opportunity I have to gather evidence about their operations. Over the next week, I went through Blackstone's evaluation process, meeting with different representatives who each gathered additional information about my background and circumstances. Each interaction revealed more about their systematic approach to identifying and recruiting vulnerable veterans. They asked probing questions about my family relationships, my financial stress levels, my concerns about civilian employment, and my housing situation. The pattern became clear. They were looking for veterans who were isolated from family support, facing financial pressures, and dealing with uncertainty about their future prospects. Veterans who would be grateful for any assistance and unlikely to ask too many questions about the nature of the work they were being offered. By the end of the week, I had documented enough evidence to expose their recruitment methods and potentially shut down their operation. But as I prepared to contact federal investigators, I received a phone call that changed everything. "Ms. Chen," the voice on the phone was professional but cold. "This is Director Walsh from Blackstone Security Solutions. I understand you've been going through our evaluation process, and I'd like to invite you to visit our regional headquarters for a final interview." "I'd be happy to schedule an appointment," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the chill that ran down my spine. "Excellent. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Our facility is located at 1247 Maple Street in Millbrook, my childhood home." They were inviting me to a final interview at the house I'd grown up in, the house they'd manipulated my family into selling, the house that was supposed to be my sanctuary during this difficult transition period. "I'll be there," I said. "I'm looking forward to meeting you, Ms. Chen. I think you'll find our final offer quite compelling." As I hung up the phone, I realized that Blackstone had been playing a longer game than I'd understood. They hadn't just manipulated my housing situation to make me vulnerable to recruitment. They'd turned my childhood home into their regional headquarters, a psychological warfare tactic designed to demonstrate their complete control over my life circumstances. But they'd made one crucial miscalculation. Instead of breaking my spirit, their manipulation had transformed me from a transitioning veteran into a determined adversary. Tomorrow morning, when I walked into 1247 Maple Street, I wouldn't be going as a desperate job applicant. I'd be going as a career intelligence specialist, with a mission to expose and destroy their operation. The next morning, I parked my truck across the street from my childhood home and took a long look at the house where I'd grown up. It looked different now, with new security cameras visible on the corners of the building and blackout curtains covering windows that had once let morning sunlight stream into my bedroom. As I walked up the front steps, the door opened before I could knock. A man in an expensive suit, mid-50s with the bearing of a former military officer, extended his hand in greeting. "Ms. Chen, I'm Director Walsh. Welcome back to your childhood home." "Thank you for the invitation," I replied, stepping into what had once been my family's living room. The furniture was gone, replaced with conference tables and computer equipment. Maps covered the walls where family photos had once hung. "I imagine this must be somewhat surreal for you," Walsh said, watching my reaction carefully. "Coming back to your childhood home under these circumstances. It's definitely not what I expected when I started your evaluation process. Ms. Chen, let me be direct with you. We know exactly who you are, what your military background involves, and why you've been going through our recruitment process. The question is whether you're here as a potential employee or as an adversary." I met his gaze steadily, drawing on. 22 years of military training and 3 combat deployments worth of experience in high-stakes situations. "That depends on what you're offering." Walsh smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "What we're offering is the opportunity to work with us voluntarily, using your skills in intelligence gathering and analysis for well-compensated private sector assignments. The alternative is to continue fighting us, which would be unproductive for everyone involved. And if I choose the alternative, then you'll discover that we have significantly more resources and patience than you do. We've been monitoring your situation for months, Ms. Chen. We know about your disability claim processing, your financial circumstances, your family relationships. We know about your conversations with Lieutenant Colonel Martinez and your brother's business arrangements with us. So this was all planned from the beginning. The house sale, the recruitment process, everything. We prefer to think of it as career guidance for valuable former military personnel. You have skills that are useful in our line of work, and we've created circumstances that make our employment offer attractive to you. I looked around the room that had once been my sanctuary, now transformed into the headquarters of an operation designed to manipulate and control my life. Director Walsh, You've made one significant miscalculation in your planning. And what's that? You assumed that manipulating my circumstances would make me desperate enough to accept whatever terms you offered. Instead, you've given me a mission. I pulled out my phone and activated an app that Jess had helped me install, broadcasting our conversation live to a secure server, where federal investigators were monitoring the feed. You've just confessed to systematic manipulation of military veterans for illegal recruitment purposes. That confession is being recorded and transmitted to the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Task Force. Walsh's expression didn't change, but I saw. His hand moved slightly toward what was probably a concealed weapon. Ms. Chen, I think you've misunderstood the nature of this meeting. No, Director Walsh. I think you've misunderstood who you're dealing with. I'm not a desperate veteran looking for help with housing and employment. I'm a career military intelligence specialist who has been building a case against your organization for the past 2 weeks. The front door burst open as FBI agents flooded into the house, weapons drawn and voices commanding everyone to get on the ground. Walsh raised his hand slowly, his expression finally showing genuine surprise. Federal agents. Everyone on the ground now. As Walsh was handcuffed and read his rights, I stood in the middle of my childhood living room, watching federal agents secure evidence that would shut down Blackstone's veteran manipulation program. My phone buzzed with a text from Jess. Outstanding work, Warrior. The FBI has enough evidence to file charges against the entire operation. 6 months later, I stood in the same living room, but everything had changed again. The federal investigation had resulted in multiple arrests and the seizure of Blackstone's assets, including Fortress Investments and all their real estate holdings. Through a legal settlement, my childhood home had been returned to my family, with the deed now properly registered in my name. Marcus had cooperated fully with the investigation and had used his contacts in the real estate industry to help federal agents identify other properties that Blackstone had acquired through similar manipulation tactics. His business had survived the scandal, and our relationship had been strengthened by working together to expose the operation that had targeted our family. My parents had initially been resistant to admitting they'd been manipulated, but the evidence gathered during the investigation had made it clear that their financial pressures had been deliberately exploited by professionals who specialized in identifying and targeting vulnerable military families. The disability benefits I'd been waiting for had finally been processed, providing me with financial security and the freedom to choose my next career steps without desperation or external pressure. I'd decided to start a consulting firm specializing in helping veterans identify and avoid predatory recruitment schemes, using my experience with Blackstone to protect other service members from similar manipulation. As I unpacked boxes in my childhood bedroom, now converted to a home office, I reflected on the lessons I'd learned from this experience. Private military contractors and other predatory organizations counted on veterans being isolated, desperate, and grateful for any assistance offered. They used sophisticated psychological manipulation tactics to identify vulnerabilities and exploit them for profit. But they'd underestimated the strength, intelligence, and determination of the veterans they were targeting. My military training hadn't just prepared me for combat operations overseas. It had prepared me to fight for my fellow veterans here at home, protecting them from enemies who wore business suits instead of enemy uniforms. The house where I'd grown up dreaming of serving my country had been transformed into something I'd never imagined, the headquarters of an operation designed to exploit the very people I'd served alongside. But now it was home again, a place where I could continue serving my fellow veterans by protecting them from those who would take advantage of their service and sacrifice. If you're a veteran who has been contacted by companies offering services, that seemed too good to be true. Or if you're a family member of someone who has served, please remember that legitimate organizations don't manipulate your circumstances to make you dependent on their assistance. Trust your instincts, ask questions, and don't be afraid to seek help from official veterans organizations if something doesn't feel right. The fight to protect our veterans doesn't end when they come home from deployment. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who pretend to be friends, who offer help with one hand while stealing your independence with the other. But as I learned from my experience with Blackstone Security Solutions, veterans have the skills, intelligence, and determination to fight back against those who would exploit our service. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in protecting those who have served our country, please subscribe to this channel. Every subscription helps us reach more people with stories that matter, stories that shed light on the challenges facing our military community and the strength we find in standing together against those who would exploit our service and sacrifice.